Welcome to the wild world of the diagnostic laboratory industry, where we focus on science, compliance, sales, marketing, and self-mastery. Welcome to Lab Results with Blake. I'm your host, Blake Bork. Super excited today to introduce you all to somebody that I've known, I feel like now since 2018. So we're going on 5 years. Yep. Dr. Amanda Natalizio. Before the podcast started, I was telling her I can go 5 or 6 different ways because she's one of those very special people that in every area of her life, she's kind of figured out a way to master it and rolls with it. Doc, how you doing today?
Doing good.
Yeah. So I want to cover just a little bit about the background that I know about you, just so that way, people in the audience understand, how complete you are. And then also I'm going to brag about you a lot today because of how much I respect your knowledge of laboratory and science and compliance and patient care. But a little bit of a history from you. Where'd you go to school?
Well, I started off undergrad, Wittenberg University, a little liberal arts school in Ohio, and moved on, got my PhD at UNC Chapel Hill in beautiful North Carolina, which now I'm in Houston, but I really do miss North Carolina and the seasons and topography and beautiful beaches. Galvin's not so beautiful.
Is it like super surprising to you how hot Houston gets in the summertime?
Oh yeah, it's miserable. You just don't go outside.
Because in Louisiana, like, we have a special brand of heat. And I go to Texas thinking that it's not going to be that hot, but then you go to Houston and somehow it's hotter than it is actually in Louisiana.
Humidity.
It's nuts.
Where's the humidity?
Yeah, crazy. So you got out of school, and then your PhD is in what?
Genetics and molecular biology.
Did you always know that's what you wanted to be?
Yeah, pretty. I knew what I wanted to study. I knew what I liked. Even in high school, I wanted to do genetics. My mom sort of discouraged it. She's like, "Oh, I know a geneticist that's in crop engineering, and he doesn't make enough money. You need to go to med school." So initially, I was pre-med. And then I did a research stint at Case Western over a summer. And I was like, nope, back to genetics. So I sort of knew as a freshman in high school that genetics was very interesting to me, and I excelled at it. And I just was hungry for more knowledge. So I sort of always knew. I didn't know what I would do with it, but I just sort of always follow what my interests are. So
yeah. So
I think I'm successful.
What was it about genetics composed to, say, the idea of practicing medicine that made you go more the geneticist route?
I suppose for me, it was, I'm always, like I said, I'm always hungry for knowledge. So I felt like if I went medicine route, although there's advances in medicine, you're sort of a lot of times as a practicing doctor regurgitating what's given to you, and it's sort of slower in clinical practice, right? So there's a lot of learning and a lot of experimenting, and you're sort of out there on the front leading edge in the research. That was exciting to me. And I really loved my PhD. I love learning new things, but the pace of it wasn't fast enough for me. At a certain point, because it's very grueling when you're doing a PhD and you're repeating the same experiments and it's baby steps forward. So I really thought that I wanted to be on that leading edge and learning and discovering new things, but that was almost too slow for what my mind needed. Mm-hmm. But then also I already knew before even doing a PhD that being a practicing physician would also not be a great fit for what I sort of craved and always wanting to learn and do new things. It was so I was self-aware of that going into even my undergraduate.
I think that's one thing that a lot of people have a misunderstanding about medicine and healthcare, and that's how formalized, how regulated it is. Where we have these standards and a standard of care. And so you may have like a urology specialty, and they very much have, this is what we can do and this is what we can't do. They don't want to go out on that. You said leading edge, but definitely they don't want to go out on the bleeding edge and do things that they're, yeah.
they'll get sued.
right?
They don't want to say, oh, well, this is what standard practice is. You went outside of standard care and then something bad happened. Now they're sued because that person was injured in some way.
Yeah. I would say that probably 3 out of every 10 conversations that I have with physicians, when we're talking about something that's like advancing patient care, the conversation of malpractice insurance and getting sued comes up.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, it's not even like it's in the back of their mind. It's actually in the front of their mind. They want to make sure that what you're telling them is in line with what their current standard is. So it is hard to break through sometimes with some of these more novel, innovative ideas.
Right.
So after you get out of college, you know, you're going to be a geneticist. What did that look like, your early kind of career? Where'd you gain the type of knowledge?
I never really knew about there being a career track for a PhD in clinical diagnostics. I always thought, okay, you either do academics and you do research. And I knew after doing a postdoc that pace wasn't right for me because I would be really into a project and then I'd sort of learn a lot of information and that sort of plateaus. And then I was like, okay, twiddling my thumb, kind of bored with it. So I always thought, okay, well, the only other avenue was going into biotech and doing R&D in biotech. But I happened to start applying for jobs and I ended up landing a position as a variant scientist at a clinical lab, at a very large clinical lab. So it was just luck that I ended up there. I was with a really great group of variant scientists, learned a lot of information, and that was my first exposure to clinical diagnostics. And I really loved it. We even were exposed to the validation process, wasn't really exposed too much to the regulations. I knew when the CAP inspectors would come in and things, and I knew that there was regulations. But as in my nature, after a few years, I sort of, all right, peaked in where I was learning at a pace that I was happy with. Even though I really liked the group I worked with, I knew that I was ready to do more, and sort of stretch my wings a little bit. And I thought that the clinical diagnostic space was a good area for me to stay in. And so I ended up landing a position as a manager of a small lab. And that's when I learned everything from regulations to organization, hiring, staffing, operational processes, LIMS systems, validations, nitty-gritty details, like product launch, market research. Like I sort of was exposed to it all, and I'm really grateful for that experience. And that experience was what I knew. I was like, I'm staying in this.
Was that CAP, COLA, CLIA? What was
the CAP lab? It was a CAP lab. Yeah, which CAP is one of the more difficult accreditations to get, partially just because you're peer inspected, never know who you're going to get inspected by. So it's very variable in how they interpret the regulations.
So give a little bit of one of the things we try to do here is educate our audience on kind of these nuances that are inside of the diagnostic lab space. And a lot of folks, lab reps, as well as new lab owners, don't understand the difference between CLIA, CAP, COLA, JCO. Inside of your world, it's CLIA, CAP, COLA. Give a little bit of a breakdown on some of the differences there.
Yeah, so all labs, except for the few states that are exempt, like New York, for example, fall under CLIA. And CLIA is a federal regulation that sets basic guidelines that labs have to follow. So you get a CLIA number, you sign up if you want to open a lab, you register. That's administered at the state level, even though CLIA is a federal regulation, the states administer it. And so you apply through the state to get your CLIA number. Each state has their own process on how to do that. There are states that are pretty lenient, states that are a bit more strict, require more paperwork, maybe require licensure for staff. So when you register, you get a certificate of registration. And when you register, you can either opt to be inspected by the state, or you could opt to be inspected by an accreditor. So there are various organizations, accrediting bodies that are recognized by CLIA, the federal mandate, to inspect laboratories, CLIA laboratories, clinical labs. And you're defined as being a clinical lab if you are testing human specimens and you're providing those results for diagnostic purposes to a provider or a patient. So there's other labs that wouldn't necessarily apply to. If you're doing research, it's de-identified, you're not actually providing that information. But most other labs that are testing human specimens have to go for CLIA or go to the state, like New York, they have licensure, so you don't have to have a CLIA license. You can have a New York state license that would be recognized. So if you're going to be inspected by the state, once you're inspected and you pass, that usually happens within 2 years for sure, but within that 1 to 2 years is normally when they're going to come out. They usually give you a certificate that's 2-year certificate in most states. Once you pass your accreditation or your inspection with the state, that's when you get a certificate of compliance. However, if you're going after accreditation, once you are inspected by your accreditor, that's when you're going to get a certificate of accreditation. And so I know some states, they won't even let you go through and get your billing certifications. If you want to go with like California, I believe they may require, like the Medicaid requires that you have either a certificate of accreditation or compliance. You can't just be registered. They want you to already have an inspection. So there's some nuances around
state to state
billing and state.
Yeah.
Each state's different. That's definitely trips people up. And even if you are not a lab in California, you're an out-of-state lab, say you're a lab in Texas, and you want to accept specimens from California, you have to have an out-of-state California lab permit in order to process and result out test results for patients that reside in California. In New York, same thing. A lot of labs just don't even accept samples from New York because New York is the most stringent regulations that are out there. Yeah. So a lot of labs just won't even go after it, and
or they can't.
We're not even going to bother to try and get specimens or test patients that reside.
The cost, the time, and then also like it really is top level, very hard. One of the things you said in there too, I know you use California as an example, but one of the gaps that I see a lot of lab owners not realize when they're taking samples from other states is that some states you have to follow, like if you're taking human samples from their state, their patients, there could be some paperwork that you have to do to make that all right.
Yeah, so there's quite a few states that do require that you go through their application, pay the fees. There's some states you have to, like California, that you have to submit validations, you have to submit paperwork. That's like technical paperwork before they'll issue you a license and you can start to accept those. And I've seen quite a few labs, unfortunately, that have gotten tripped up on that, and they just start accepting. They're like, hey, we've got our accreditation, we can accept samples from anywhere, and they don't realize that there are certain states that have regulations, and those regulations can change. Like, for example, Florida used to require an out-of-state permit for clinical labs, but they no longer do. So these are things that you have to keep up on them because they're state mandated.
Right.
So they constantly change.
So if you're a salesperson, you're listening to this and your eyes just crossed, there's layers and layers and layers of regulation just inside of what we just talked about. It's three different possible rule books times 50 possible states on top of the actual federal regulations that kind of sit on top of it. CLIA reports to most of the time Health and Hospitals. Health and Hospitals reports to CMS, that regional office. And so you have this regional effort. Moral of the story is if your laboratory ever says we can't do that because, it's typically because of CLIA or COLA, right?
Yeah. So a lot of times, yes, there's some sort of regulation that, and it may be that a lot of times we can't do this yet or now because, hey, we just signed up this doctor in this other state. Well, we can't accept those specimens right now, but let us go through the paperwork and do it. So it's better to plan up front about, okay, where are we hiring lab sales professionals, or where are they going to be targeting, so that the people within the lab they're dealing with accreditation, any regulatory stuff can be on top of it, apply ahead of time, because sometimes those can take anywhere from 60 days to a year to get your permit. So you need to be on top of it.
So when you're having to turn in the validations for California, maybe a little bit more just along the lines of getting a laboratory up and running, we hear a lot of if you know, people have had experience with toxicology laboratories, understand that this validation process can be very long, very complex, and again, depending on the state, it can vary on what the rules are. I got hammered in Louisiana by some really specific rules that kind of changed mid-flight for us. Give me some examples of our workflow and what actually has to happen for you to get a method validated in molecular.
So assuming that the lab is already has a CLIA ID and already has proper staff, that's the big thing too, depending upon where these labs are. Sometimes it can be very difficult to get the proper staff. And not only are they on paper qualified, but are they actually competent to be able to manage that department and that test method? Because molecular is very different from doing any sort of mass spec testing like toxicology. And even within toxicology, for example, there's screening that's super simple, that's moderate complexity typically, so it doesn't require really high level staff. But then you have your high complexity testing for toxicology, your confirmations, and that requires someone who has many years of experience and is specialized and has technical competency to be able to troubleshoot and design a validation. So that staffing component is super important to look at up front. But once you have the proper staff for a validation, if it's a high complexity validation, you have to go through your designs, you have to purchase all of your equipment, you have to purchase all of your reagents. And a lot of times, especially with mass spec, you may do an initial design of your validation and you'll run it on the instrument and it just doesn't look good. And so you're going back and you're tweaking, rerunning, and mass spec in particular can be very, very finicky. So that process can take many months to get optimized depending upon how big your panel is, how many drugs you're testing. And then once it is validated, there's a lot of different points that have to be hit for that. And it depends upon who your accreditor is and what state you're in as to how that validation, what sections of that validation should be in there. There's CLIA guidelines on you have to have these minimum, but there are other regulations depending upon where you're at, who your accreditation agency is, that they specify what needs to be within each of those sections also. So that can vary. There's nuances to how you go about a validation. Same thing with molecular. COLA and CAP have very specific validation requirements that you have to meet. And those are updated sometimes annually. So what you did last year for a validation may not be compliant if you do that validation again today. So it's very nuanced.
I remember whenever we were first trying to, this is one of the problems with guys who come from outside of the industry and then they come into it. So this is, for me, it's like 12, maybe 15 years ago, whenever I first came in. It was 2010, so 13 years ago. So we thought that we could speed this process up because, you know, we were software guys and we were like, oh man, we're going to be able to do this a whole lot faster. This whole validation thing taking 6 weeks to be able to do this. Oh, we can really speed that up. And at the end of the day, like, science has to take place. You know, like, you can't, you know, like, you have to do your runs, you have to get your results. These injections take a certain amount of time, depending on your panel, what you're trying to accomplish. And we just couldn't get it through our heads that this was just, it had to take as long as it needed to take. And I swear we fought it for 3 times the amount of time that it would have taken for us to just do it. like just to submit to the damn work and just get it done and just realize. The other thing is we made the mistake. We hired the wrong people a couple of times in doing this. Like as I'm going back and replaying a tape on how I wish I would have had a Dr. Amanda the first time I went through it. Although I probably would have like argued with you too, because that's just who I was back then. But we found people who talked a good game. We hired them, we paid them, and then they could not get it done. They couldn't deliver it. Right.
Oh, I've seen people say they'll deliver something and they come in with a jump drive and say, here's your validation. And there was no wet lab done. I've seen it more than once.
Yeah.
I say that. So you have to be very, very careful about who you're hiring as a consultant.
Yeah. We hired those people.
Yep.
That
there are a lot of dirty players out there.
That was my literal first experience, 100%. And we were, we didn't know what to expect. And this was one of the things too, in a post-COVID world. So this happened in talks, definitely in the, 2012, 13, 14, because it was kind of like a gold rush where there was a lot of people who were coming in because of the money. And then it happened again after COVID because there was a need and people were.
I've seen it. I've seen it for molecular validations too. When I go and I do a mock audit and I say, hey, I go back and I ask, where's the raw data? Why is this all 100%? That is fishy. I'm sorry, but your validations and your accuracy and your sensitivity, like none of that's always 100%. So as soon as I see that, and I don't see any numbers in there other than 100%, that's a very big red flag. And I found labs where they're like, oh, well, we can't find that data. Can't find that data. It wasn't done.
Right. And that's how you're going to get inspected, right? They're going to ask you for your validation summaries and for the raw data and very specific. You were mentioning earlier, just you kind of brushed over it because of how high of an expert you are. You were talking about making sure people are competent, but there are specific guidelines on competency evaluations and making sure that people have like transcripts in your personnel binders in the laboratory.
Yeah. So that's one of the very first things that the inspector will typically ask for. They're going to say, where's your org chart? So they can see how your lab is laid out, who's at the top, who's your director, where your technical supervisors, wherever your testing personnel, wherever your accessioners and things. And then they're going to say, I want to see your personnel binder. And they will go one by one and make sure that all of those people in that process are, not only are they qualified, do they have the right education and training and certifications if need be, but for that position and what they're doing, but also they're going to look for competency documentation. And there's very specific things that need to be documented for competency. For are they competent to be doing the tasks that they're doing within the lab when they're touching a patient specimen? So if they are prepping a specimen and doing an extraction and putting them on the instrument, each one of those steps, there has to be documentation of that and raw data to show here's the run they did you get expected results, etc.
And then there's like the maintenance logs. There's the temperature logs. There's the actual physical, making sure that you have a QMS process, a quality management system. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I see a lot of labs fail in their documentation where they don't have a quality assurance plan in place. So when you go with accreditors, I typically like accreditors, especially COLA, because when they come in, they really understand that you should have your basis for here's where we're performing, this is where the minimum needs to be, and you're going to get shut down if you're not there. But really, with any business, including labs, you should always be improving, right? That's what a quality assurance program is. And you're not going to be improving if you're not monitoring to see where you're at and are you going the right direction, so that you can pick out where your problems are and focus on them. So one of the things that you need to have in place is a quality assurance program. Some labs do them better than others. I have very specific programs that I like to implement and document, so that it really gives you a good visual of where you're at and what direction you're going. That's something that the inspectors are definitely going to be looking at. There are specific policies and procedures that they require that you have in place, and there's a lot. I think typically most of the labs that I set up have a minimum of 50 to 100 policies and procedures in place that have to be reviewed like annually every 1 or 2 years by the director. And then there's also going to be your quality control, and is that reviewed? So when you do your runs, when you're testing patients, having your quality controls and reviewing those. Did your positive controls pass? Did your negative control pass? Do you have a individual quality control plan or an IQCP in place if you're not running those every day? I see labs get tripped up by that a lot, especially with some of the newer molecular panels. They do not have a good quality control plan that they're actually reviewing in place. So those are the major things they'll look at. The other thing that I often notice, labs are scared to point out any errors that they've made. But if you don't see a corrective action, so whenever the lab makes a mistake, or if there's any sort of a specimen that comes in and needs rejected or wasn't handled properly, you should write up a corrective action or an incident. If there's an incident, write up an incident.
It's crazy. It's crazy to me how much they fight that. You know what I mean? Like, it's supposed to be a continuous improvement process.
It does. And the inspectors want to see that.
Yeah.
Because if they catch the error themselves and they don't see that you already identified it and wrote it up and had a plan of action and corrected it, you will get written up for it. But
and they assume that it was wrong from the beginning of time. They go all the way back. Like, if you can prove that you caught it and you fixed it, that's a good thing. That's a pat on the back. It's a good job. You guys have a good plan. You're finding what's wrong. You're correcting it on your own. You're a mature laboratory.
That's a cornerstone of a quality assurance plan. And if I don't see corrective actions monthly, the labs that I oversee, and I'm not signing those and reviewing those, then I ask the lab, where are the corrective actions? Because you're not going to lie to me and tell me there were no mistakes this month.
Right.
Because there are always mistakes.
Let me ask you this. We're looking at everything that goes into that, like the corrective actions. I think one of the other knowledge gaps is that a lot of laboratories don't realize that we're not just talking about what happens in the laboratory. We're talking about the pre-analytical process too, all the way to specimen collection, requisition forms, specimen transport. I've seen some laboratories getting some serious trouble because they didn't have these stability studies and specimen transport really thought out. They rolled out some collection processes that all of a sudden needed to have frozen bricks, and it kind of kills them. Talk a little bit about that pre-analytical piece and some of the things they need to be aware of.
Yeah, one of the major deficiencies that are frequently cited actually are stability studies. So especially during COVID, they were a little bit more lax with citing people because supply chain, it was hard to get a good supply. The supply chain was just terrible during COVID. So you'll have different medias that you can collect. Say you have your NP swab, your nasal swab, and that could go into saline, or it could go into an inactivating media. It could go into a VTM, a UTM, etc. But all of those different collection media, collection devices, and then what you're testing can have a different stability. How long can it be in that media? What is the temperature during that length of time? Also, when you're in transport, let's think about in Texas in the middle of the summer when it's 100+ degrees out. I've had labs do stability studies where they're going to put it in the back of their trunk in 100-degree weather and see how long it's going to last, because you don't know if you don't have ice blocks, dry ice, if that's not coming cold, doesn't arrive cold, you can't guarantee what that temperature was of that specimen. So I've had labs written up for not doing such studies if they aren't putting some sort of temperature controlled device or monitoring what the temperature is of those specimens during transportation. So you can always basically do more stability studies because there's so many variables, but you should at least have some of the bare minimum. And if you don't know if your specimen's not stable for 7 days, well, and you only have it out to 2 days and you accept a specimen that was collected 3 days ago, should you process it?
Right.
So,
and they're gonna wonder when Medicare's paying you for something and they're expecting a quality product, and you can't say that the product was quality or not. It can go all the way down to the give us our money back because you had this conditional level deficiency.
Right. Right. Yep.
You know, so it's super important if you're a lab owner out there and you've set up your laboratory, if you're doing COVID and you've decided, well, look, man, I have some quants, I'm going to go ahead and get into infectious disease. More than likely, you're probably at this point in time, you're already into infectious disease, and you're realizing that the world is a whole lot more complicated inside a lab than you originally thought. And you may be wondering, why the hell am I doing this? I should probably just sell everything and move on. And you might be right. It's a fair question for a lab owner to ask themselves, because unless you're super passionate about patient care and you are committed to this life and realizing that there's a culture of urgency that happens here, things have got to be done right. It's a continuous improving process. You're constantly learning, and then it's changing. The battlefield's changing. That people are making decisions.
And it costs money to do things the right way. It costs a lot of money to do things.
Let's talk a little bit about that. The price conscious CEO. No, so there's the Navy SEALs taught us this. They said you either do it right or you do it again. Two ways to do it. You either do it right or you do it again. And cutting corners are always going to come back to bite us in the butt. So if you have something off the top of your head, Doc, that just kind of proves that point as far as like how you can go ahead and save some money on the front end, but it can end up biting you in the back end, please share.
Oh, I've had multiple labs that have gone. There's a lot of molecular vendors out there that sell their assays with validations, and they say they're doing validations. They're not doing validations. They're not doing compliant validations at all. They may do a couple runs and they write something up and maybe make up some data, and I've seen that. And then they have to cease testing because they don't have proof that their test works. So a lot of those molecular tests that are out there right now are laboratory developed tests. So you have to go through the most stringent within the laboratory studies in order to test patients on those. And it costs money to do it. It costs money to do it.
I want to break this down just a little bit. So just so that the audience knows. All right. So when we're a laboratory, we have a couple options. We can do something that's out of the box, that's FDA approved, which has its own validation. You need to still be able to prove that you can get those results inside of your laboratory, right, Doc?
Yep.
Then we move on.
It's typically called a verification, like a moderate complexity test. Wave tests, you don't have to do anything. Is it best practice to at least run it? You at least have to have competency on the people that are running those wave tests. But wave tests are the simplest, like pregnancy dip test, something like that. Some of the biofires are waived, if you're familiar with biofire. But there are biofires that are moderate complexity too, is the next level, which requires a verification.
So then you come in. So and a lot of these moderately complex tests, we'll see them in hospital laboratories. In fact, I know massive hospital systems that are moderately complex because
they're typically moderate.
Yeah. And that's because that's the standard of the expertise that they can get, and they're not taking on the extra burden of having to be highly complex. But in doctors' offices, you see a lot of moderately complex FDA approved tests, your flu swabs, your RSV swabs, your COVID swabs that are kind of done at site. I guess maybe pregnancy test, urinalysis, those types of things, right? But then you get into big boy land where you got to commercialize something. And inside of our laboratories, we do laboratory developed testing. And that is damn near close to 510K for FDA approval coming soon, huh?
That's what the FDA is threatening. They've been threatening it for a long time. I hope it doesn't happen. I have
talk about where it's at right now, like the different, like the laboratory developed testing. Because I mean, lab to lab, if you've seen one lab's test, I tell this people all the time, you've seen one lab's test, you've seen one lab's test,
right?
Like its results with that equipment, with those reagents. I remember there's a common guy that we know, and he was right. We were arguing about the what is it whenever you send off your samples, and
what sample?
what's that?
clinical correlation or split
Yeah,
sample analysis.
correlation studies, when you send them off and they do the blind test, they come back and they give you your actual results. And he was telling me, he's like, dude, we're 1-on-1. And I was like, there's no way we're 1-on-1, bro. And he was like, we are 1 of 1. Nobody else in the country is using our equipment with our reagents. I didn't believe him. So he sent me the actual report. And sure enough, in the peer group, 1 of 1. That's a scary place to be when you can't compare yourself against anyone else.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's where a lot of the cutting edge labs are. I have several labs that are doing tests that are on that leading edge that no one else is doing that test. And so they try to, and there's no commercial proficiency testing for them to test it or anything. So that's where it's very important that they have to have very robust validation studies with proper controls. And sometimes those controls are really hard to get and they're imperfect. So when you can't do those clinical peer correlations between labs to say, all right, am I performing similarly to another lab? It is a little bit scary to know.
You're on your own.
Yeah.
And depending on what you're selling, that uniqueness could be a benefit. If I'm going next gen sequencing and trying to sell the oncology piece, the cancer piece, but if I'm doing basic chemistry, clinical blood, and the expectation from all doctors are it happens this way because that's what they're used to, it's tough, man. It's tough to be on an island by yourself trying to do something that everybody else has done for the last 30 years, you know?
Right.
You don't want to reinvent the wheel whenever it comes to that. But if you're looking at, you're wondering why your lab's taking so long to validate, these laboratory developed test methodologies, especially what's coming down the pipe, are only going to get harder. And if the FDA does what they say they're going to do, they're going to control it. And we don't know what's going to happen past that. Right.
And if you don't go with a reputable vendor and you cut corners on reagents and things, you also will have a much lengthier validation, which many times will end up costing you more money because you're going to have to go back and redo everything to find a new vendor that has reliable reagents.
Yeah. I'm gonna sum this up. A lot of people make this decision, the difference between, say, $25,000 for the validation versus $40,000 for the validation. Fair numbers, Doc?
Yeah.
It could be the difference between the cheap end's 40, the high end 60. Regardless, that's the type of money that we're talking about. And so what ends up happening is the laboratory pays all the payroll for the validation to happen. They pay all the time, all the reagents. They get it on the machine. They test with it, inaccurate as it is. They bill with it. They go all the way through to the point where they get inspected, come back and find out that the inspection wasn't good. The reagents weren't right. They've had problems with it because typically you're going to have problems with the assay.
You notice it. You see it when you're testing patients. Yep.
Your doctors will notice it.
They will complain.
They'll start, you'll have some inaccurate. They'll be like, dude, there's no way this person wasn't taking this drug, or there's no way that I had 7. This happened to me in my old laboratory, so I can talk about it. And this is why the laboratory director and us separated. We had 7 positive Klonopins in the same day from 7 different practices. And every one of the doctors said I wasn't prescribing my patient that.
Right.
And so we were like, dude, we had some type of carryover. Something had to happen. And he was like, no, there's no way. That's not what happened. All those patients are taking it. And it's like, dude, do you realize the chances of this happening? 7 for 7. 7 patients say I didn't take it. 7 doctors say I didn't prescribe it. And they're positive is like winning the lottery. Like, it can't happen. And he was like, no, man, I'm telling you, my method's perfect. And sure enough, it was carryover. We went and we looked.
And that's a prime example of, you need to do a root cause analysis. You need to write it up as a corrective action, have a plan in place to say, here's what we're going to do so this doesn't happen again. And one of those plans may be, when you see this happening, you hold the results and figure out, is this real or not? Maybe it's you rerun those so that doesn't happen again.
We actually ended up building a heat map to make sure that we looked at results on the plate to see what they look like, because that was the best way for us to figure out how it would never happen again. We had a cool software team back then. I had a good applications guy. But anyway, so back to the example. So you go through this whole thing because you tried to save $15,000 on the front end, and then you get suspended, or you can no longer test. They tell you to stop testing. You can't use it. And along the way, sales reps have had to sell an inferior product. There's the potential that you've been releasing incorrect results to doctors. Doctors have picked up wind of it, and you don't know why you're not able to pick up traction with those doctors, but it's because they don't.
Or even those doctors may have released patients because they haven't been compliant when really they were, and it was the lab's fault. Patient harm.
Right. And so that happens because we're trying to cut corners on the front end. And I understand that if people don't know better, but then there's some people that they do know better and they don't care better.
Right.
And that ends up being a problem too. So there's no spot. This is one of the problems that we have in lab is there's no like truth stone for us. There's no place to go where you can get all the answers, right?
No.
Where do you get all the answers at? Where'd you get all your answers from? Just from trial and error?
Trial, error, experience. And I've been in dozens of labs and I've seen the gambit. I've done a lot of mock audits too. And I've directed a lot of different laboratories in different spaces and consult different labs. So, and I've from startup to ones that are already in operation and looking to grow, big labs, small labs. So I've just seen a lot.
What's your favorite client? Your favorite type of client that you love to work with?
The ones that actually care about quality and want to do things right, because it makes my job a lot easier and it sets them up for success.
Isn't it a lot easier if the conversation's always driven around patient care? What's best for the patient?
Yeah. Patient. That should be the number one thing when you want to open a lab is what's best for the patient. Is what I'm doing the best thing for the patient. You, of course, as a business, they have to be profitable because it's not best for the patient if you go out of business and you're the only lab that is, say, you have this unique test. There's added, benefit for that patient. And if you put the patient first, that's most important. But if you're not also thinking financial, then you are not going to be able to put the patient first and offer that test. So it's always sort of this balancing act where you need to have accurate results for patients to put patient care first, but it's still a business and it can be very hard to juggle that.
Really the hard part, it's almost like a rocket ship is like getting through the atmosphere, because once you have enough business and you're able to cover your payroll and you have good quality people and you have a great team. And that's one of the things I've always really envied about you is you've been able to keep a good team around you, and you know what it is to have a good team and how important people are to the process. But once you get through that, you can bust through, and it all of a sudden now you have something that can scale nicely.
Yeah.
The thing that's plaguing a lot of lab owners right now is they're having to deal with, they're out of network. Doctors are harder to close now than they've ever been. A lot of sales reps that would rather stay with the devil they know than try to venture off and because they don't want to be let down again. Switching jobs and going for job hopping, especially in the lab business, can be super, super stressful. And not getting paid what somebody promised you, or not delivering a test that was promised to you that they'd be able to have, it ends up burning, your reputation out. That's a true thing. But then you have the lab owners that are difficult to deal with too. And you said you've been in dozens of different laboratories and you've dealt with different teams. Those lab owners and those lab managers have a worldview that's different than yours. How do you come in and get them to start doing things the right way?
I'm a very facts-oriented person. So I will show them the regulation as here's why I'm saying that you need to do it this way. And you can either do it this way or be out of compliance is normally how sort of approach it. And that typically tends to work pretty well. Other scenarios, it sort of depends. And a lot of times I will give them some options about how to be in compliance, and maybe they're not going to get exactly what they want out of it. And then same thing with staffing, where if they don't want to hire a particular person, I show them the regulation and say, this is who you have to have in place, or you're going to have to shut down testing because you don't have the right personnel. And as you had said, to me, a laboratory is built on the staff. But that's who's going to carry that through. Yes, you're going to have the technology, everything else, but who is going to be able to troubleshoot it, which you have to have very good troubleshooters in your lab. In order to troubleshoot, you have to be very specialized and competent at what you're doing and deeply understand the technology and what you're doing to be able to troubleshoot. If you can't do that because you don't have the right staff, you're going to have poor quality results and you're going to have delayed turnaround times and you are not going to be able to grow your business. So I usually just try to make a case for compliance and regulations and cite them and build a picture for them about what their business could look like if they don't have quality top of mind. Not that it always works, but that's the nice thing about consulting now. And they don't want to listen to my recommendations. That's okay. They're still paying me.
Yeah.
For my advice.
You know, I mean, that's, I tell you what, though, it is one of those things where ultimately the lab owner owns the decision. Yep. I've hired a ton of consultants that'll tell me what I want to hear. And it wasn't until I had this flip around where it was like, no, I'm paying them for them to tell me the truth. I have to listen to what they're saying. And when they don't, when a consultant doesn't have a vested interest in your business and you do have an open and honest conversation, with them and they are telling you the hard truth, especially men, our ego is to try to like push it away and push it aside because it's like, oh, they're not listening to me. They don't know what they're talking about. It's like, no. They're the PhD, they're the expert. I'm paying them to tell me the truth. I need to listen to what they're saying. I think a lot of male executives, I don't mean to be sexist, but it's the truth. A lot of male executives have a hard time with actually paying people to tell them the truth. I'm saying that, you don't have to agree with me, but that's me. So
I've had that experience.
Yeah.
Personally.
Once we get over it, man, I mean, I got like five or six consultants I know for a fact they were trying so hard to shake me and make sure that I wasn't going to make a mistake. But I was just I just knew that I was right. And I couldn't have been more wrong. And so, I mean, really, really and truly, there's a zone of genius that happens in lab and it takes a team. Not everyone can do everything. In fact, the crazy thing about laboratory is I can own the laboratory, but I got a general studies degree. So I legally can't operate the lab. I legally cannot walk in the laboratory and manipulate a patient sample. And that blows some people's mind. It's like, no, it's true. Like I cannot work I can't work in the bench in my laboratory. If I do that
legally,
compliance. Legally, I can't do it. And so you feel like you're being held hostage a lot of times as an owner, because if my med tech doesn't show up, then no samples can be run. If my lab manager decides that they're going to take a week's vacation, there's nothing I can do. If they decide that they're not coming back and I don't have a replacement, I'm stuck. And so a lot of small laboratories are fearful of that. And I'm putting you on the spot with this one. What are some good ways that small laboratories can build some resilience with their people and with their teams that they may not be aware of?
For smaller labs, what I typically like to do is to hire more experienced techs that can qualify as a general supervisor of whatever specialties that they're running and have more than two. So rather than hiring a general supervisor and hiring a tech, you would hire two people that are qualified as a general supervisor, maybe one with a little less experience. So you'll put one as the actual supervisor and maybe one as a lead tech. So if you have turnover, that other one can step right into that position and you can hire someone in, because there's always going to be turnover. And it depends upon the location, of course, of the lab. And you're in the middle of nowhere, Arkansas, it can be very hard to recruit. In Houston, it's pretty easy. But even when you have a lot of staff, like a big pool that you could recruit from, you still have at least a week of training. Even if someone's super competent, because they have to learn your workflow, your policies, your procedures, read everything, sign off on everything, document all your competencies, do all the runs. before they can even touch a patient specimen and report results. So even if you think you can easily hire someone in, if someone, you know, quits on you next day, I like to, for the smaller labs, have at least 2 people for that general supervisor role, because that general supervisor role is someone who needs to be on site. And maybe they aren't always doing things at the bench, but they can step into that role if the tech's out. And if someone needs to go on vacation, because you always need to have 2 people. Because if you have one person running your entire lab, they never get a day off. They can't be sick. They don't get vacation. So what happens when they go on vacation? Well, that other person has to step in, and guess what? It's not compliant for a tech that's not qualified as a general supervisor to work independently without on-site supervision by that general supervisor. So that's typically why I'm always going to recommend that you have those 2 people in the lab.
Do you see labs go the PRN route, like what hospitals would do, where they'll have, you know, a bunch of part-time employees to kind of cover, you know, somebody will pick up extra shifts, like maybe just 1 or 2 shifts a week? Do you see labs do that?
Helix actually does do that for some of our clients, where we have some techs that can be part-time, but that's local. And these labs are managed by us. Their workflows are very similar. So the techs can easily float between the labs. If it's a moderate complexity lab, it'd be a lot easier, but a lot of labs that we work with, the more specialized high complexity labs, it can be very difficult to get a part-time worker that can just fill in randomly. Because it's so specialized, you have to keep those competencies up. So that's sort of where Helix Molecular Solutions has stepped in for some of the local labs in Houston that we work with, because we do have staff that are trained and can jump in to these molecular workflows in particular. But typically I have not seen that in other areas of the country, just because the workflows in particular for high complexity are lab specific, and keeping those competencies and all the personnel documentation, even you got to have that for a part-time personnel, because they're touching patient specimens. That can be, you're getting into the gray area, and are those labs going to be compliant because they don't have all the proper documentation in place? So I do not see that very often.
So, because I'm thinking of, you know, how remoting in to have somebody actually have the competency, or have the not the competency, have the competency and the right requirements to be able to say do the data piece and remote in to help. But then you just made me think. I was reading an article the other day.
That does happen. That's an exception. If it's data analysis and review, that does happen remotely, so that they don't have to be on site. When they need to be on site, that's where it's difficult. So if you're trying to get like a general supervisor and technical, like testing personnel need to be on site. They are touching the specimens physically, but your scientists and your technical supervisors, and the testing personnel that are just doing data analysis and interpretation, those are often remote. So it's easier for them to be part-time. And I do see that a lot, especially in toxicology, but the on-site people, not so much.
So you made me think also, we used to raid. I hadn't thought about this in a long time. We used to, I say raid. So we lived across, as I think of a suburb. I was like 26 miles away from New Orleans in Mandeville, Louisiana. And a lot of people had to travel to the big city to work. And so what we started doing was recruiting these hospital lab people and getting them to stay and not have to go and recruit. And we just offer good benefits. But what we did, we went to a 4-day work week for some of our lab people. So they'd work 4 10s. And then if they wanted to pick up an extra day, they could. But then we would have 2 10-hour days, because we were a 6-day-a-week lab, not a 7-day-a-week lab. But it was perfect because we had some hospital people that were full-time on their other job and they wanted to pick up the extra work. So that's actually how we accomplished it back in the day, is we offered a 2-day shift. It was 20 hours a week. It was perfect. It was a part-time shift and people came in and they got the extra hours.
Yeah. And I've seen some of that, but it's not super common.
Not super common.
There's a lot of people that sign non-competes and they can't do that.
Good call. It's true. They'd have to get permission in order for them
Mhm.
to go work for at an independent laboratory. My biggest thing right now is there's not enough talent to go around. Because
Oh
what
yeah.
the other thing that COVID did do is it spread out the workforce of everybody needed a technical supervisor. Everybody needed a general supervisor once they figured it out. So good people got paid a bunch of money to go work at Frat Bros Lab. And now they're waiting for Frat Bros Lab to either run out of money or decide that they're not going to continue to do testing anymore. So these people are scattered all over the place. Are you seeing that, or is that just kind of?
There definitely is a shortage of clinical laboratory staff for sure. I mean, there's lots of articles out there, and the programs, the amount of people that are coming into the programs are maybe a tenth of what the demand is out there on the market. So it's very high demand, but the odd thing that I'm seeing is, especially for the testing personnel, the entry level, it doesn't seem like the wages are increasing enough in order to incentivize those people to get into it. And honestly, that's probably part of that is constant cuts to reimbursement. The labs can't afford to pay because they don't get paid on from a lot of the private insurers out there because they're not in network, or they don't, it's MolDX, whatever it may be. The labs are struggling, and it's always prices increasing on cost of goods, but reimbursements going down many times. So this is not a winning proposition, right? So they can't really afford to pay the staff to incentivize them to go that route.
They have to run a good business, and not anti-lab at all. It's I'm in this community, but when the majority of laboratories knowingly run patient samples that they know they're not going to get paid on because it's just in the basket, because a doctor sends 20 samples, if you're out of network, you're going to get paid on the Medicares and you're going to get paid on whatever you are in network with, but you're going to get goose eggs on the rest of them. And laboratories do
those balancing what's best for the patient, running it.
Well, the thing about it is
but you're going to go out of business if you keep doing that.
That's the thing is like when we think like I can't see my doctor unless I pay my copay before I go back. I tried the other day. It's like I left my wallet at home. The truth. You guys, they're like, no, you can't see a doctor. You have to pay your copay. Period. So that's the frame that they have. The hospitals, I went to the emergency room, they collected the copay before I went back. Big gash in my head. I paid before I went and see them. But for some reason for labs, it's like it's taboo to ask for the patient to pay a part of it because we don't have the technology that we've developed to make that make sense. And so, no, I agree with you that right now reimbursements are getting cut and they're going to continue to get cut, and we can see it, but labs have got to flip to smarter ways to be able to make the money, because every time I do, volume is just a guaranteed expense. Every time I run a test that I'm not getting paid on, I am 100% losing money. And at least asking the doctor to ask the patient if they'll pay something in a process has got to be a spot that we start going to.
Yeah.
But our competition as lab owners, this is what I heard you say, it's not only lab to lab. When Taco Bell's paying $22 an hour, you know what I mean? When Office Depot is paying $25 an hour, when you can
work at
you go work at a Buc-ee's. I feel like I could get a job working at Buc-ee's. I do. I feel like I get a job running Buc-ee's. And if and Buc-ee's pays well. And so everybody who walks in Buc-ee's is thinking that. They're like, man, I think I could work here. For those of you who've never seen a Buc-ee's in Texas, they're amazing. But being able to keep a good team is super important. It goes into the culture, but from a standpoint of like, if you want your people to stay and you don't want to feel like you're being held hostage, you got to really get in the weeds with them and make sure that you understand what they're doing, how they're doing it, why they're doing it. And so that way you can hire help. It's the only way you're going to be able to grow.
Yeah, and you need to listen to your staff. Part of that's getting in the weeds with them. And a lot of people don't want to listen to the staff. So they know where the problems are.
Have you ever had a lab CEO like step down and actually go pour pee or spend time in the laboratory and actually like really, really work?
I have seen, I did see it during COVID some, but that's very, very, very rare. I
Yeah.
think I've seen it once.
Yeah. We tried a couple times. We used to have our salespeople would come in and actually go through a whole orientation. In fact, everybody in my company started by pouring pee. CFO started his new job, he poured pee. HR director started her new job, poured pee. Didn't matter. Everybody came through orientation. The first thing they did in the Tox lab was pour pee. And in that place, you realize this is the basic. Filling out a requisition form correctly and making sure you have all the right information. That's the key
Right.
to it all. And so
Right. So, yep.
if you can't
Then
do
you can
that,
see where the problems are.
that's right.
Yeah.
That
At least on the upfront.
I mean, that shipment comes in and you have clean requisition forms and clean information and you got samples, it makes everything else so much easier.
And they're not, the samples haven't leaked all over and you have pee filled rec forms and bags.
How do
you
you
understand
manage
how important it is to
how do you
collect
manage sale? Like think about like sales reps and operations. Maybe this is the last topic we'll touch before we break, but this is another thing I talk a lot about, but the culture of sales and operations kind of coming together. What are some of the best practices? What can a salesperson do in your world that just makes the lab's job so much easier?
Honestly, the salespeople that have come in and actually sat down through the accessioning process, handling the specimens up front and seeing where the problems are and like, oh, I really do need to focus on getting this piece of information because this is delaying things. Now the lab staff have to go get an attestation. Going through an attestation process to gather that information helps them to better understand why the lab's asking for certain things to be done. So that when they better understand why the lab is asking for things and how they are overlooking maybe how they're training or how they're selling things to the clinicians and the providers, they will better focus on where they can see that there were problems because they understand the problems better if they've actually had their hands on it and had experience with that problem. Rather than just being over the phone, why isn't the lab doing this? Why you got to go through this process? I think having them in the lab hands-on initially is when I've had salespeople do that, I've had a better experience being able to communicate with them when there are problems.
Yeah, I think it's unmatched, straight up. I think it's the best thing any laboratory can do is get your salespeople and really your support people in the laboratory because you're now speaking the same language. It's so much easier to have that shared experience and be speaking from that place like you've seen it, you understand it, you know it, than to be trying to like say, well, this is why, as opposed to remember when.
Right.
You know, because salespeople, we cause all the problems. Every problem is our fault. You know. So, Doc, any words of wisdom you can give to a new laboratory or even an existing laboratory? And then I promised you I'd get your contact information up front. I didn't, but we'll cut it and put it up front. So just know that. Give some words of wisdom for a new laboratory real quick.
Make sure you have a business plan in place. And if you're talking with someone who is just trying to sell you reagents and set your lab up, be very cautious because I've had multiple clients that have come to me for just due diligence, getting another opinion from a consultant. Even consultants that aren't selling anything, they will happily take your money and set up your lab. But do you have a business plan in place? What do you want to validate? Is that going to pay? You have to have a business plan. And just because you have a billing code assigned to a particular test that you're doing doesn't mean it's going to get paid. So you need to talk to a billing consultant before you move forward with that plan as well. Because looking at the landscape out there with MolDX, all the billing regulations, just because it looks like you're going to get paid doesn't mean that you actually get paid. And how you design your panels and how you set up your lab, knowing all the regulations, all the extra costs, you have to factor that into your business plan. And most consultants that I've seen help labs focus on one thing or the other, mainly technical. They can get you set up, but from Helix's standpoint, we don't want to set up labs to fail. Like, we are going to show you all the cards that are on the table. And we've had multiple clients potential clients that were not end up being clients because they're like, oh, I'm glad that we talked to you because this doesn't really make sense for us right now. We don't have the volume to support what the overhead's going to be here. So I think you have to have a business plan. And it seems like it's simple, but setting up a business plan for a laboratory is much more complex than many other areas that you could go set up a Taco Bell, right? Because there's a lot more regulations involved. So get multiple opinions from consultants and make sure you have a business plan in place that is looking across the regulations and what billing looks like.
What are the three main questions you'd ask yourself
For
that business plan?
What's the cost going to be to get the capital equipment and to do validations? Mm-hmm. What staff do I need and how easily can I recruit them, and what's that cost going to be? And then what is my panel going to look like? The tests that I'm going to run, what's the reimbursement look like realistically? And speak to a billing expert that knows in your region and where you're getting samples from, how is it paying, and not only the region, but what do you think your payer mix looks like? Is it Medicare, Medicaid? Is it Blue Cross Blue Shield? Is it United Healthcare? Because that matters. Mm-hmm. If you think you're going in and it's all Blue Cross Blue Shield, or it's all United Healthcare, and you thought it was going to be Medicare, that's a nail in your coffin oftentimes if you're a molecular lab. Mm-hmm. So you think you had a good business plan, but you didn't understand what your payer mix was going to be from your patient population, and now you're done for.
Yes, ma'am. I give you three more from my standpoint on the other side, outside of the laboratory, but thinking about selling that product. I need to know if it's going to pay. What are we credentialed with? Because we're going to focus on Medicare, but then what else can we get credentialed with in the state? I gotta know the state that I'm in because of what you said earlier at the beginning of the podcast, how important it is to make sure that we have identified the states that we're going to work in so we can do all of the actual pre-work. Make sure that we have the CLIA paperwork done, get a jump start on credentialing. So you give me the test that we're going to be selling. I got to find out what state we're going to be selling it in. And then after that, I'm looking for who's the dominant laboratory in that state. Where are their people at? And I'm going to try to recruit them over to work for your lab. Mm-hmm. If there's not a dominant local laboratory in the state that you're in, it's not that it makes it harder, but I mean, when you're looking for talent, people who already have business, sorry to say, but finding salespeople that already have business that work for labs in that state, I want to know who the competitors are.
It's the same for lab staff too. If you're not in an area of the country where there are other labs doing the specialty that you're looking for, it can be very hard to recruit the proper staff that are qualified from a regulatory standpoint to manage that lab, let alone from an actual real experience to be able to manage a lab.
Because I can market to, like, I can be in Louisiana and have great business in New Mexico. I can do that. What I don't want to do is think that because I hire a good salesperson in California and they have 800 samples, that those 800 samples are going to pay. Or that because I have a good person who works in Florida, the same thing's going to happen, especially whenever I find out the regulatory chaos that happens in those two states as well, and capitated plans and IPAs and everything. So I think if they just slow down and they get the state that they're going to be in and then put a fence post around that state and develop that market, really invest in the market, find the people who want to be there and want to work there, and just work the territory. It doesn't have to be the spray and pray type of approach. Doc, I really appreciate you spending some time with me the day after Thanksgiving.
Thanks.
We didn't get the chance to talk about the fact that you deadlift and you're the best baker that I've ever met. But my family's going to hate that I said that, but it's the truth.
I appreciate that. I enjoy baking. So
what's the best, it's science. What's the best way for people to get in contact with you?
So I can be reached at, if you go to helixmolecularsolutions.com, we have contact on there. Our number's 832-463-0053, or you can reach me at info@helixms.net.
Beautiful. We'll cut that up and I'll drop the information and the links and everything in the comment section. Doc, thank you so much. It's always a pleasure.
Yep. Thanks for having me.
Alrighty, bye. You've been listening to Lab Results with Blake, with your host, Blake Bork. Please like, share, and subscribe to this podcast. Remember, greatness is contagious.